Morning again. I genuinely feel I don't need to say very much now. It feels like the words of a hymn like that sort of do it for us, don't they, sometimes? So I'm not sure I can better the words of the song. But in any case, let's have a look at John chapter 18. We've looked at a whole load of different passages in John's Gospel over the last few weeks, 2 months maybe, and we're carrying on with that theme. Hence, I wanted to come to chapter 18 and this amazing story of what happens after Jesus is arrested and dragged away from the garden. Smells. I'm told the sense of smell is the most evocative sense that we have. Sometimes when you smell something, it connects with something else in your mind, perhaps from your own life, from your history, and creates a very strong connection. Smells are very distinctive, aren't they? They're often very unique. For me, for example, in East Africa, when the rains begin, that you get that first huge rainstorm on the dry earth, and this smell comes up from the ground that's unlike any other smell. I don't know what it is for you. Maybe there's something in your memory that is connected with a certain sort of smell. One sort of smell that's always very distinctive is the smell of barbecues. We like that in summertime. It doesn't quite smell like anything else, does it? You know the smell of a barbecue when your neighbor 3 doors down is having one. The smell of a charcoal fire is very distinctive. And there was a charcoal fire that night in the courtyard of the high priest's house. You see, we're told, aren't we, that Jesus gets dragged away from the garden, and just 2 of his friends follow, Peter and John. And one of the wonderful things about John's Gospel, of course, is that John himself is the one telling us this story. This is real insider information we're getting now. A story being told by the people at the very heart of it. So Peter and John follow along, and they arrive at the courtyard of this great palace, we guess it is, where the high priest lived. Jesus has already been taken up inside by the soldiers. And John, it so happens that he knows some of the people on the gate. We're told there's a lady there at the entrance, a sort of bouncer, and she lets John in because he's known to her, but Peter has to stay outside. Now, in Jerusalem, in springtime, it can be pretty cold. It can snow in Jerusalem right into March and April. It's a cold night, this. And there's a charcoal fire burning in the middle of the courtyard. The guards and others who have perhaps been kept up late because of the momentous events happening around them are warming themselves by the fire. John goes back to the entrance when he realizes that Peter hasn't been let in. He speaks to the lady there, says, this guy's with me. And she looks a bit closely at him and says, you were one of the ones there in the garden, weren't you? Your face looks familiar. No, I wasn't one of those. He says very quickly. Okay, well, in you come then. Peter and John both inside the courtyard now, huddled around that fire, warming themselves. And the way John tells the story, he interweaves this story of Peter and John in the courtyard with the story of what's happening to Jesus before the priests. So imagine on the one hand we've got Peter and John and the others huddled around this fire on this cold night over here. And then not very far away, perhaps even within sight, you've got the true light of the world, having all the insults and the scorn and the derision of the world thrown in his face. Peter and John over here, terrified faces lit up by this fire that we keep being told about. And actually, John has prepared us for this image. He told us in chapter 1 that the light shines in the darkness and that the darkness has not understood it. He prepared us for this moment from the beginning of the gospel. Standing around the fire, they're still there, Peter and John. Someone else recognizes him. Again, he says, I'm sure you were one of the ones in the garden. But again, straight away, no, not me. You're thinking of somebody else. And even a third person then, another person, says he remembers Peter because, back in the garden, just a few short hours ago, Peter was the one who drew his sword and tried to defend Jesus with the sword. Right? He put himself out there, Peter did. I'm sure it was you. I would recognize that face anywhere. No, you're getting me mixed up with someone else. Nothing to do with me, is all that Peter can say. Notice that John himself, the author of the gospel, doesn't say anything, doesn't defend, doesn't open himself up as being a follower of Jesus either. He just stays quiet and colludes. Now, John's Gospel, and I think I mentioned this probably last time I was doing this, it can seem, sometimes when you're reading through it, I know some of you have done that in Word one-to-one or other contexts, it can seem very sort of abstract, can't it? It can seem to be, sometimes you get these great long discourses of Jesus, where he's saying all these very, very spiritual and wonderful sounding things, but they're quite hard to follow what it's all about, and it can seem very sort of spiritual sounding. But other times, it's incredibly down to earth and material and physical, and you get these extraordinary eyewitness descriptions that just sound so vivid. Imagine in one of the early chapters, Nathanael sat there under his fig tree, or the servants at Cana dragging those great big earthen pots and trying to fill them up with water. Or Jesus at the tomb of Lazarus, weeping real human tears. Or just a couple of days later with Jesus at dinner with his disciples, taking that towel and scrubbing their feet. It's a very vivid gospel as well as a very spiritual one. And perhaps better than any of them, this picture of the charcoal fire, where Peter and John stand gripped by fear and saying nothing at all. It must have been a night that neither of them would ever forget for the rest of their lives. And I'm guessing that every time they smelt a charcoal fire, they thought of that. They thought of the fear and the hurt and the sense of failure and the pain of that night. And they were never allowed to forget it. Every time they smelt a fire, they would have thought, oh, I remember. That's what happened. Some of the Gospels, like if you read Mark, for instance, it sort of progresses in a linear way. It sort of starts by beginning to tell us a bit about who Jesus is and then reveals more and more and more and more. But John's Gospel works very differently. It tells us right up at the beginning exactly who Jesus is and what this is all about. And then it sort of progresses by building up that image in a variety of sort of layers and images and pictures, all of which swirl around each other until gradually our image of Jesus becomes more and more focused as the whole thing progresses. But right back at the beginning in chapter 1, he's telling us all about what this is, what's really going on here. He's explaining to us, if we'll listen to his images and his imagery, what it is that's really happening. If we just go back to the very beginning of chapter 1, in the beginning, he says, in the beginning. Right, which is a way of telling us that this is the book of Genesis rewritten. This is the book of Genesis, but not as you know it. This is the Bible from the beginning that we're giving you here. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And he was with God in the beginning. See, the Word was there. He was there already at creation. Through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made. He was there at the beginning in that garden with those first people. And now here he is at the other end in another garden. Eden to Gethsemane, as Jesus faces the ultimate sacrifice. In that first garden we had Adam, back in the book of Genesis, terrified of the consequences of his actions, hiding from God, not able to face what he's done, and then thrown out of that garden, exiled into a world of bloodshed and vengeance, and the story gets worse and worse. Adam in his garden completely failed to do what he was supposed to do, what he was put there to do. But Jesus in his garden doesn't shirk what he's put there to do. He faces up to it. Peter couldn't cope with that. Peter in the garden draws his sword. He tries to defend Jesus. Put that sword away. Jesus, put that sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me? So the failure of the one man in the first garden leads to death and misery, and that glorious self-sacrifice of another man in the second garden leads to salvation and glory. In that first garden, the first Adam failed in every way. But now the true Adam is here, being sent to his death so that the garden could be restored. And ironies just pile up one upon another as the gospel progresses. And actually, perhaps the biggest irony of them all, and it comes up a number of times in the gospel, is where Jesus says the Son of Man is going to be lifted up and exalted. And what does he mean by that? We're not left in any doubt. He doesn't mean lifted up on top of some cloud somewhere. He's going to be lifted up on a cross. He's going to be lifted up on a cross. That is the exaltation of Jesus, according to John's Gospel. And with all that irony in the world, Pontius Pilate, the governor, having condemned Jesus to death, he points at him and he says, "Behold your king. Behold your king." And we're going to stand and sing now to really get this into us, because this is so key to John's Gospel. The exaltation of the Son of Man is on the cross. So, brothers and sisters, when we look at Jesus as our king, when we say Jesus is our king, we picture him on the cross. We picture him on the cross. And we say, "Behold our king seated on the throne." And we're going to sing that now, just to help focus our minds on that Jesus, and then we'll just come on to a few other verses at the end as well after that. And as all this is happening to Jesus, let's not take our eyes off Peter and John there, still standing around that fire. How loyal Peter thought he was going to be, right? How strong and brave he thought he was. But Peter only ever half understood Jesus, and it's the half he doesn't understand that lets him down, isn't it? Soon Jesus will say to the priests, "My kingdom is not of this world." But Peter thought that it was. And all that disappointment and bitterness and anger freely flowed from him as he denied that he knew Jesus. And I wonder how often in later years, as he traveled around the world, spreading the good news and discipling believers, how often someone would say to him, "Peter, tell us that story again of what you did on the night that Jesus was on trial." And he would heave a resigned sigh and have to tell the story all over again of what he had done. See, to fail and to fail again is the lot of each and every one of us, Peter down. And we don't need to pretend otherwise. We just need to be thankful that our failures don't hold up God's plans. Because actually, at the end of the day, Peter's denial of Jesus makes no difference to the story. The story is in control. Jesus has got it. His denial makes no difference to God being able to put into effect his plan of salvation. Failure doesn't disqualify Peter from being part of the kingdom, and it doesn't disqualify you from the grace of God either. So smells evoke memories. And Peter and John, in years afterwards, would have always associated the smell of a charcoal fire, whenever they smelt it, with what they had done on that night that Jesus was arrested. Or did they? I ask myself. Is that what the charcoal fire meant to them whenever they smelt it? Because there's an amazing thing in John's Gospel. The amazing thing is that there's another charcoal fire. There was another one. And if you read on into the later chapters, you'll see that not very long afterwards, when Peter and John and their friends are fishing out on the lake, as they used to do in years gone by, they see someone standing on the shore. And they look at it quizzically. And it's John who recognizes him first, and his heart skips a beat. It's the Lord, he says. Can you imagine what's going through Peter's mind in that instant? It's the Lord. But Peter doesn't hesitate. Peter never did hesitate. He jumps off the boat straight into the water. And with all the power that he's got left, he scrambles towards the shore. And when he reaches it, what does he find? Another charcoal fire. This time flickering merrily in the light, with frying fish on it and bread. And Jesus standing there, arms open wide, ready to receive him. No darkness anymore, no leering faces, looking at them out of the gloom and suspicion and failure. That's all fallen away now, as the light of the world is standing by the edge of the lake, welcoming them back. And as Jesus restores Peter, and he says it 3 times, he says to Peter 3 times, feed my lambs, you, feed my lambs, feed my lambs. Once for each denial. And as he says that, all Peter's failures and fears and all that darkness is dropping away. Peter's sins, there were many, but God's mercy was more. Not once, not twice, but every time. And sometimes we find ourselves in similar situations, I guess, to Peter. And one of the members of our church wrote this recently, and it struck me, and I just wanted to share it with you. They said, sometimes our road through faith is straight and clear, and we travel it quite easily. But then the time comes when that road becomes unclear. It's full of potholes, and we question it. And we reach a crossroads, and we wonder, am I continuing on this road? Or was that the wrong road, and I should be going a different way? Well, when Peter was at the crossroads, as happened in one of the earlier chapters you can read, he threw up his hands in ignorance and confusion because he didn't know which way to go. But he just looked at Jesus and says, Lord, you have the words of eternal life. You know which way to go. I can't read the map, but I know a man who can. And he always followed him from that moment onwards. So as we close up this morning, and we'll stand and sing again in just a moment, let's picture before our eyes those 2 charcoal fires. One in the dark and the cold of the hostile city, where Jesus' friends are weak and alone in the world and their failures, and where Jesus drinks to the full the cup of suffering that the Father has given him to drink. And he takes upon himself the pain of all mankind. It's a cold fire, isn't it, really? They can't have been very warm, bleak and cheerless. But then let's keep in mind that second charcoal fire by the quiet seashore, where Jesus is standing with arms open wide. And there, new life and new hope are on offer for everybody who's willing to just go into those arms and be received by Jesus, just as Peter did, without really another thought. He knew where to go, and Jesus was there with arms open wide, waiting to receive him. Peter's sins were many, our sins are many, but his mercy is more.